Hello everyone and welcome to Stronger Minds with me, Kimberly Wilson. I'm a chartered practitioner psychologist and author with a master's degree in nutrition. So I talk about psychology, mental health, food and everything in between. The aim is that you leave this short podcast informed and in possession of some helpful practical tips to support your well-being. This is part 2 of the Brain Health Q&A and I'll be covering binge eating and the links between stress and dementia. So let's get started. Question 1 is, could you overview how not socialising affects the brain and what different things this leads to? I'm going to interpret this question as asking about the effects of loneliness on the brain because, of course, there are lots of perfectly healthy reasons not to socialise, including resting after a period of being very social. So if we start with a clinical definition of loneliness, it's the discrepancy between your preferred and actual social relations. The UK government's loneliness strategy defines it as, quote, a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. It happens when we have a mismatch between the quantity and quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want, end quote. So it's a subjective rating, and there are lots of different dimensions of loneliness which I won't have time to go into here. But loneliness scales will ask things like, how often do you feel left out? To which the answers are hardly ever or never, some of the time or often. Loneliness has been associated with a range of negative mental health outcomes, including poorer sleep, faster cognitive decline, increased risk of dementia, depression and anxiety, as well as reduced lifespan. But why should this be? It's understood that loneliness is harmful because it's a signal of danger. Humans are a social species, and while you might sometimes wish that the people around you would shut up and go away, we of course need each other. Babies, for example, are born utterly helpless. And during our evolution as a species, cooperation would have been essential for hunting, gathering, protection from predators and enemies, and so on. In short, being part of the group, being connected, means safety, and being separated or isolated means danger. So loneliness switches on the stress response, and physiologically, this is where we encounter the harms of loneliness, because chronic stress is bad for the body, brain, and mental health. So, as an example, loneliness increases the functional connectivity in the visual parts of the brain. In psychological terms, we link this to what's called hypervigilance, which is a kind of anxious watchfulness where you're always on guard. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense because if you were out in the wilderness by yourself, you'd have to pay much more attention to threats compared to if you were with a group. But this hypervigilance also leads to the person experiencing the world as more threatening and then interpreting things in a way that confirms that. So the world essentially becomes more dangerous and more frightening when you feel alone. And that's partly because your brain is focusing on the negatives just in case in order to protect you. Additionally, there is increased cortisol production and higher levels of inflammatory cytokines, which have negative effects on neurotransmitter synthesis and can alter the structure and function of the hippocampus, which is the brain's memory center. Next question. Will years of anxiety disorder and panic attacks, about a decade, basically mean dementia for me? I think this question was on a related theme, as in, if anxiety equals stress, does a decade of being stressed mean that I'm destined to develop dementia? Of course, it's impossible to answer this question with any certainty. And moreover, I really want people to understand that when I say increased risk of, that's very different from saying definitely will happen. They're very, very different statements. So for example, someone who smokes has an increased risk of lung cancer, but of course many smokers will never develop the disease. So while anxiety in the research literature does increase the risk of dementia, it doesn't definitely mean it will happen. But perhaps if this is the case for you, if it's something that you're concerned about, then your experience of anxiety or your concerns about it are encouragement for you to do whatever you can to help to build cognitive reserve and support your long-term brain health. And these things are things that I focus on in my first book, How to Build a Healthy Brain. The next question is, what does being in love mean for the brain? The neurochemistry of love is really interesting. When researchers look at the brains of people who are madly in love and looking at pictures of their beloveds, the areas of the brain associated with reward light up. This has led some to consider the period of falling in love to be a kind of addiction. And if you've ever fallen in love, I'm sure you can sympathize. Essentially, dopamine is in charge, which makes you feel euphoric and preoccupied with the focus of your affection. And two other hormones are also increased, oxytocin and vasopressin, which play important roles in attachment, pair bonding, and sexual desire. Okay, next question. How do you lower homocysteine? How do you test for homocysteine? Or once it's high, are you doomed? So, homocysteine is a naturally occurring amino acid, which is part of a protein, and at high levels it's associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease and dementia. So it is considered a biomarker for these conditions, or the risk of these conditions, but it's not clear whether it's a cause or a consequence. So for example, the fact that there are always firefighters at the scene of a fire doesn't necessarily mean that they cause the blaze. So that's still an ongoing question in the research. In terms of testing, homocysteine is not something that is routinely tested for. And you will not, for example, be advised to have a test unless you fall into a high risk category, such as having a high risk of heart disease or stroke, being malnourished, and I'll explain that in a moment, being an older adult, or having a history of drug or alcohol misuse. So in terms of nourishment, as I say, high homocysteine is considered an indicator of risk, but the very good news is that the B vitamins 6, 9 and 12 convert homocysteine into methionine, which is an essential amino acid, one that your body needs, or cysteine, which among other things is a precursor to one of your body's main antioxidants, which is called glutathione. So having enough B vitamins can detoxify, can transform homocysteine into actually helpful compounds. You can make sure you're getting enough folic acid or folate, which is B9, by eating leafy green vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, and fortified cereals. B12 is found in animal foods, and in the general population, deficiency is rare in those who eat meat and dairy, though older adults are at higher risk as the ability to absorb B12 reduces with age, and vegans or people who rarely eat animal foods are advised to take a B12 supplement. So to answer the question, no, you're not doomed. Homocysteine levels can be lowered with a sufficient intake of B vitamins, which may be easily achieved through the diet or supplementation. Next question. Can we do anything to moderate the reward system in the brain? So I'm not entirely sure of the context here, but technically, yes. In behavioural models of psychology, the type of reinforcement that follows a behaviour affects how rewarding it is. So, for example, when you're training a dog to sit and they sit successfully, you give them a treat. So you're reinforcing the behaviour that you want to see. But if you don't give them a treat, then you disincentivize that behaviour. But conversely, you can also reward negative behaviours. So if you give them a treat when they run off or when they bark, you're reinforcing the undesired behaviour. So yes, obviously humans are a bit more complicated, but the basic principle still applies. And I suppose addiction could be considered a kind of moderation of the reward system, in that with many addictions there is a tolerance that builds up, which means that a larger quantity of either the substance or the behaviour, or a higher intensity of the behaviour, is required to achieve the same high. Okay, so our last question: how are food binges or addictions created in the brain, and can you ever overcome them? I will say that there's still some controversy over whether eating addiction is the correct terminology, so I'll focus here on binge eating disorder or compulsive eating. And it's probably worth distinguishing between overeating and binging as it's seen in binge eating disorder. We all overeat from time to time, and usually we do it very knowingly. So, for example, at feasting occasions like weddings, birthday parties, Christmas, Thanksgiving, that kind of thing, we'll often have a light breakfast because we know that we will overeat on delicious things at the event. And that behaviour is considered very normal, absolutely fine, not a problem. But clinically, binge eating or binge eating disorder is characterized by recurrent bouts of eating large quantities of food very quickly and feeling out of control. People will often eat until they are uncomfortably full, and these bouts of eating are followed by negative feelings such as shame, guilt, disgust, and low mood or depression. Now, there isn't a clear equation for how someone develops binge eating disorder. There are some risk factors, so things that will make it more likely, though of course, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean that someone will definitely go on to develop the condition. The risk factors for binge eating disorder are vast, and they include a family history of eating disorders, so perhaps some genetic component, being in a situation or environment where there is pressure to be slim, so athletes or dancers, traumatic experiences either in childhood or in adulthood, and in adulthood is often within 12 months of the onset of symptoms, mood disorders such as depression or anxiety, poor emotional regulation, experiencing weight stigma and internalized weight bias, and dieting or other rigid, restrictive eating practices. So it is a complicated disorder, but yes, you can recover from it. Treatment options include guided self-help, psychological therapy, especially CBT, and/or medication. I will say that if you are looking for a therapist, please make sure that they are a qualified mental health professional, because binge eating disorder is a mental health condition. And there are lots of unregulated eating disorder coaches, some with absolutely no qualifications or training, charging hundreds and sometimes thousands of pounds. And some of these people may be doing more harm than good. So please, please be very, very careful. Okay, that's all I have for you today. If you like me in your ears, you might enjoy me in your inbox. You can sign up for my weekly newsletter where I tackle a different mental health theme every month. Things like the psychology of taste and flavour, love, and the psychology of money. You can sign up in the link in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider either sharing it or leaving a positive review. I would appreciate that very much. And that just leaves me to thank you very much for listening, and until next time, take very good care.